one of the areas here that I thought was really interesting that you wrote a paper on has to do with microbial endocrinology. So, can you explain what that little subfield is and start to talk about the microbiome in that context?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is a super exciting field because it connects the endocrine and so the hormonal changes in our body also to our microbes, and I think it really underscores how tightly connected all of the processes in our body are. We tend to think about hormones as a way that is very, very human, that affects puberty, it affects estrous cycles, it affects a lot of parts that we think that are intrinsically human. But what it turns out is that the hormones that we produce can be modified by the microbes in our gut, and they can change either by activating or deactivating them. So to give you a very high level summary about this, in either the testes or in the uterus, there's hormones that are produced. And so for females, we mostly think about estrogens, and for males, we mostly think about testosterone, but these are produced both by males and females. And when they're produced and they're given out into the blood, they usually come associated with some specific proteins that would prevent them from actually becoming active. And there's also some modifications that happen in the liver that inactivate these hormones. So the body is constantly turning off these hormones and the way that they act. So while normally when we go, say, get a blood drawn and we look at these hormones, we normally take a look at the overall levels, but it's not always that you'd be looking at the active levels, which ultimately are what make a difference. And so while the liver continuously inactivates these hormones and shuttles them in a way that will make them more likely to go out in urine, a lot of gut microbes actually do the opposite. They will take away this inactivating molecules and will activate them again. And so you have this balance in which your microbes can activate them. Some microbes can even degrade hormones like testosterone. And you have this balance in which now your body is responding both to cues that come from our own cells and cues that come from the microbiota in order to change these processes.
I see. So the microbes can directly. It sounds like they can directly modify things like sex hormones.
Exactly.
Are there any things? Are there metabolites they produce that have estrogenic or androgenic effects? So, for example, are there certain components in food that are eaten up by the bacteria and causing them to spit out something that has a hormone-like effect in us?
Yeah, so this can happen in a number of different ways. Like there are soy-rich products that can be metabolized into compounds that look like estrogens, and so like these can get cross-react with estrogen receptors and give some of the same effect with estrogen.
So you said soy-rich products?
Yes.
Okay.
The other thing that can happen is that there are some microbes that can produce their own hormones, particularly in the case of testosterone, and they can do this starting from cholesterol in a very similar way to how as humans we use cholesterol to get down to hormone creation.
Do we know the net effects of any of that? So for example, soy, like soybean oils, things like that, very common. They've become much more common in recent years than they have in the past. Is that having like a net estrogenic or anti-estrogenic effect through some kind of competition between these estrogenic metabolites and our endogenous hormones?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think a very complex one. I'm not aware of, I guess, of a full agreement about this. That there are human populations that have consumed soy for millennia, and in as part of their normal diet and their normal cycle. So I don't think that a blanket statement would be appropriate, but it really very much depends on how different microbiota are balanced. It also depends on how the diet may be balanced with other compounds. But there's definitely some of the data that I think is very strong in showing the impact of the microbiota on modifying these hormones is that when we look at animal models that do not have a microbiota, so these are we were talking about that with in humans, in mammals anyway, in the uterus, there's not thought to be a microbiota. So there's animal models that can be derived by C-section and do not have microbes anymore. And so these can be a way in which we can test, like, what is the effect of not having a microbiota? And so in these animal models that don't have a microbiota, but have an otherwise normal function and normal diet, we see that they have very strong changes in their puberty, in their sexual function. And so this underscores the importance of the microbiota in having some of these changes to hormonal health that are normal.
I see. So it sounds like most of the details around all of that have yet to be worked out, but we at least know that if you take away the microbiome entirely, you see hormonal and other effects that are strong enough to change things like when puberty happens. So pretty major developmental changes.
Yeah, and some of the other studies that have been done have been, for example, around prostate cancer. And this is a disease that often there's imbalances and maybe too high levels of testosterone. And one of the things that sometimes is done in patients that have prostate cancer in a way that where there's too much production of testosterone is that there's a castration that takes place to try to reduce the testosterone and limit the impact of the negative impact of the testosterone. But there have been some patients that were found to be basically insensitive to the castration. They were still producing very high levels of hormones. And in those cases, the microbiota was implicated in this high production of testosterone. And so the mechanisms are still being worked out, but there's now starting to be a lot of data that implicates the microbiota, both in positive but also in negative ways in this changes in hormonal and active hormonal levels.
Are there any connections between the microbiome and gut hormones that regulate hunger itself? So another way of saying that maybe is, can changes in our diet or changes that we need to make to our diet for natural reasons, like, I could imagine, if a woman gets pregnant, for example, her caloric and her nutrient needs are going to change. Are there any changes there that seem to be mediated by the microbiome?
Very much so. So this is an area that I'm tangentially informed about, so I'm going to be pretty general about it, but there's definitely evidence that the microbiota can influence hunger. They can influence how the feeling of satiety, and so the microbiota is so tightly related with us that it is influenced by our circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms mean when the expectation that our body has of daytime and nighttime and of cycles of feeding and things like that. And so one of the things that anyone that has ever traveled and gotten jet lag knows is that there's definitely discomfort and changes to your digestive health and the way that you digest things. And that's partly due to the microbiota not knowing anymore what's going on and expecting food at times that it's not coming. So there's definitely changes that you can kind of experience in your day-to-day life that have to do with the microbiota and the interaction that it has with our expectation of when food should be coming or how hungry we are.
So obviously we've talked a fair amount about how what we put in our body changes the microbiome. We focused largely on dietary inputs. We talked about antibiotics as well. What about things like pharmaceutical medications? What do we know about, anything from, psychiatric medications to, say, hormonal medications like birth control? I would guess that probably anywhere you look, there's going to be some effect. But what are some of the most salient things that we've learned or that we already have some handle on in terms of other medications besides antibiotics that we put into our bodies fairly frequently that are having major changes in the microbiome?
This is, I think, a very important and a growing area of research. So anything that makes it through our gut obviously can be modified, even broken down by the microbiota, but even things that don't start out in our gut can make it there. We talked about hormones and how they can be modified in the gut. Anything that makes it through our blood system can potentially be modified in the gut because of the high interaction between the portal blood system and the gut and the exchanges that can happen there. So there's definitely a lot of effort in trying to understand how different microbes can either enhance the effect of certain drugs or prevent them. So to give you an example, there are some drugs that can be broken down by the microbiota, and so they don't have an effect anymore. There are drugs that we deem safe, and but they will have a negative effect on the microbiota over longer timescales. So to give you a sense, a lot of the over-the-counter drugs that we take, we talked a little bit about antacids, like this is true of laxatives, they will just change the microbiota because they set up an environment that is not the same anymore. So laxatives often work by creating an osmotic imbalance with the gut, which draws out water and increases the motility, while it also draws out water from the bacteria. And some bacteria can't tolerate this, and so they will go away after a long-term exposure to laxatives. And the problem, though, is that it doesn't, at least to me, it doesn't make sense to say like, well, we shouldn't be using any drugs. Like that's obviously not the point. But I think it's important to know that just like with any ecosystem, if you apply a change, there will be a response from the ecosystem. And knowing what's good, what's bad, what's neutral, those are very loaded words for ecosystems, because if you think about a forest, you can probably distinguish a forest that is healthy from one that is unhealthy, but it's hard to know whether a forest is healthier than another one if they both look lush.
Yeah. And even if you can easily identify healthy versus unhealthy when they're clearly different, that's very different from saying, so you can't just look at a healthy forest and be like, oh, it's got X, Y, and Z. So if we put those things in the unhealthy one, it will become healthy. It's exactly. So complex in like literally the math sense that you just can't predict system level outcomes from individual changes and individual variables.
Absolutely. And so, in thinking about microbiota changes, say that you want to take, as you said, if microbe X is good in you, it may not be good in me because I don't have the rest of its friends that would keep it happy, right? And so the way that this kind of applies is, I think they will have to play out on a much more ecosystem level type of health approaches.